Welcome to the latest episode of my podcast series, Conversations with Otto. I'm a postdoc fellow at New York University's Classical Liberal Institute and the Center for Bioethics, and I'm very delighted to welcome a host of guests to my show, talk about the cutting-edge issues in science, political economy, philosophy, and everything under the sun. Now, today, I'm very delighted to have as my guest my co-author and friend, and very productive, very vibrant, and I think life-filled individual, Dr. Pablo Paniagua. Pablo, very good to have you here on my podcast.
Wonderful to be here, Otto. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful podcast that you're doing, building networks among academics and also friends. So this is a lot of fun.
So, Pablo, you are an assistant professor of political economy at the Universidad del Desarrollo in Santiago de Chile, and this is also the country you were born in. But you also went to Milan to study and to spend some years in Italy, and after that you've kind of been around. You did your PhD at King's College London, the same location where I did. So that's where I know you from originally. So
Yes.
you've been in Chile, Italy, London, and you hold a position in Chile, but you actually live in Norway. You are a guest researcher at the Department of Political Science in Oslo, in Norway. Now, you've pretty much covered all the four corners of the world there. I mean, you still have a few places to chart as the
Yes.
next Vasco da Gama, what have you. But how do you find, working in so many countries? Do you enjoy being this cosmopolitan, or do you ever feel rootless in the negative sense that some people feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like I don't know if you read Amartya Sen's bibliography. It was published like a few years ago, and the title of his biography is "Home in the World." A home in the world. Basically, Amartya also moved from everywhere. He lived many places, and he has this quote and says that, for me, the home is the world. The whole world is a home. I feel at home wherever I go. I feel comfortable and at home. So I think Amartya's spirit captures very well how I feel about the world. I feel very fitting in a world and rooted whenever my intellectual curiosity and luck takes me. So I think it's been very rewarding. I love different cultures. I love experiencing different lives, different political systems, different social dynamics. Now that I live in Oslo, I live in, as you said, I live in Chile, in London, in Italy many times, in Estonia, now in Norway, in the US. I live in Washington, D.C. for a few years. So I have lived in many places, and that enriches you a lot in regards to not only languages, of course, which is like the most obvious one, but it enriches you to how to deal with human beings, how to learn about political system, about culture, history. So I think I really enjoyed doing this, although I'm a little tired, of course, of moving so much. But I think I'm gonna keep doing it. Uh, we're gonna stay in Oslo for a bit, but I think we're gonna keep doing this Amartya Sen home in the world live model. But yeah, it's also, I guess, it's challenging in the sense that because I have a permanent position in Chile. It's challenging with the time zones and with the teaching duties that I have, because sometimes I have to stay awake until like 3 a.m. Because of my teaching. But there are worse things in the world than teaching online. So I think given the trade-offs is a pretty exciting life. So I like it.
And Pablo is an expert in a lot of areas as well. So I think in addition to living in many areas, you also kind of work across disciplines, and you work in multiple areas that, although I do see a very strong thread through all of them. I mean, a lot of your work is, I guess, about governance, and especially thinking about alternative modes of governance, or thinking about link between economic systems and governance systems, right? And you've done work on polycentric governance. You have a book with David Thunder on polycentric governance and good society, I think from last year or 2 years ago. And you have written about macroeconomics. You've published in Cambridge Journal of Economics and constitutional political economy, and you and I have a joint paper in Economy and Society on cybernetics and governance in Chile during the Allende and Pinochet regimes. We'll talk about that in a bit, but how do you see that? Do you have a vision of what you want to say in terms of the overarching picture? Or do you treat every paper and every project as kind of a puzzle, a challenge, self-contained whole, or do you ever think about the bigger picture of how these projects of yours come together?
Yeah, that's a very challenging question, because sometimes I feel like I have a little bit of HDD syndrome in academia. You know, like I'm interested in a lot of things, and I try to touch a lot of things, and hence it feels like all over the place. For example, like our piece on neoliberalism and Chile, right? So it's kind of like related, but also not that related to other things that I do. So in a sense, from one side, you can say, yeah, like my interests are very wide ranging, from sociology to history to political theory. But I guess I've been trying to reflect on, is there anything that unites these things together? And I think they do have some sort of like, complementarity or relationship. And I will say the PPE approach kind of like encompasses all this. I think like my research agenda, I have 3 research agendas, broadly speaking. One, sort of like empirical political economy. One, governance of social dilemmas, governance and institutions related to social dilemmas. And the other one would be like political theory related to the crisis of modern democracy and the crisis of liberalism that, we can talk about if you're interested. I think those 3, and all of them, I think, seek to cover one leg of the PPE approach, right? So political science, economics, and philosophy. So I those 3 try to cover each one of the PPE. And so I think all these projects, they look kind of scattered, but if you look them in this overarching picture, I think they fall between these 3 lines of research that I really try to embrace living and publishing as a PPE scholar, rather than just like, rather than being just a philosopher and say, oh, I do PPE, or like a political science and like, oh, I do PPE. I try to truly, do all 3. Obviously, it's more challenging and it's a lot of more work, but I think that's the core of how I see PPE should be done, at least on Michael, how I interpret it.
No, exactly. So there's a methodological reason for it, and there's a virtue in seeking those connections where they are part of the project of solving a problem. You need to build connections and find the connections when they help you to solve a problem or to illuminate some aspect of a phenomenon that otherwise would be left, in the shadows. Yeah. And I think that's what good PPE work does, and that's what your work really exemplifies, I think.
Yeah.
And you probably also agree with the fact that now that we live in this kind of age where economics has become very formalized, it's becoming very on the one hand empirically driven, so it's driven by data, by various kinds of analysis of econometric data, which also impacts other social sciences, political science as well. And on the other hand, there's the legacy of neoclassical formal modeling, equilibrium analysis, and so on. And I think what your work is doing is partly you have one leg in this, but then you're putting all this more quantitative work and more heterodox work occasionally into this. Would that be a fair assessment of what you're doing?
Yeah, I think they're not incompatible. I think people, from heterodox camps tend to be allergic to quasi-experimental methods and causal inference. And on the other side, people from causal inference never read a book. They don't even know who Adam Smith is, right? So, but I think that's like the worst equilibrium possible as a scholar. I think you can do both. And
I think that's being a bit unfair. I'm sure they read like Intro to Micro or something.
I guess maybe in the Mankiw they read like the little box on Adam Smith, like who he was. He was born in Kirkcaldy, etc. Right. So I think that's like kind of like impoverishing both sides. I think you can try to build bridges across the heterodox camp and the political philosophy camp, and formal modeling or like quasi-experimental methods. And as you said, I think one of the best messages, or one of the best ideas that I have found in my road of becoming an academic is this idea of multi-methods, like following Elinor Ostrom's approach to you need to adapt your toolkit and your methods according to the problem that you're trying to understand. And different methods help you to illuminate problems in a different light. So I always use the analogy of this famous Indian tale about like some people in the room with an elephant. So there's like 10 people in a room with a big elephant, and they're blindfolded. So they're like covered with, they cannot see, right? So they can touch. So one touches the horn, one touches the leg, one touches the tail. So one thing is a rhinoceros, the other one thing is a camel, and the other one thing is a donkey, because they're touching different parts of the whole. And I think like committing yourself to only one view of the world, or committing yourself to one method, or committing yourself to one, assumptions about, how you should model reality, forces you to see just a horn, just a leg, just a tail, rather than trying to understand the reality and the problems through different lenses. For example, like Eleanor Lynn used like satellite data, ethnographic work, sociological work, qualitative process tracing, laboratory experiments, game theory, institutional analysis. So and everything works like properly applied. Understanding the limits, of course, of all the methods, they come together to give you a more rich picture of the social world, of social orders. And I think that's the way we should do, PPE scholarship and political economy.
So how does one choose between one method and another? I think the worst way to do it would be to say, well, there's an outcome that I want to prove, so I'm going to pick the model that best produces that outcome, right? So,
yeah.
So how does one go about doing that in a rigorous way?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's always a cherry picking. You can always, use the method according to what you want to say. I think there's always the risk in social sciences, right? That we can use the method as a Troy horse to eventually saying or getting the outcome what we want to say. And in empirical methods, there's always like a little cherry picking, or you choose to show the outcomes that tell the story, while all the other outcomes didn't come out right, are hidden in the background, right? So I think that problem is always there, and which transparency and data transparency and verification and all these things trying to like mitigate that. But I think that's always going to be present. But obviously, if we're scholars that seek the truth and seek to trying to answer questions whatever they may lead, I think we try to like best choose the method according to data availability, or like how it fits with the reality we're trying to establish. And if the method shows the wrong results, we should be transparent about it. I think at the end we should always be trying to find the puzzle and trying to see which methods are best to map the puzzle. Or maybe you can use different methods, right, to approach the puzzle. So maybe you can use, some empirical methods, some formal methods, some laboratory experiments, and they will all illuminate the same problem under different things. And if all these methods agree to the results, then you have a more robust claim of saying, okay, there's something driven there, that all these methods are pointing to the same direction, right? Whereas if you try different methods and they come with different conclusions, then you have a more nuanced conclusions to that. But I think you should try to tackle problems for different perspectives in order to have a more clear way of what is driven what, right?
Good. And so do you have a view on the question of whether the neoclassical economic paradigm, which has proven to be very fruitful and very productive, is something that kind of in this post Marshallian, post Pikuvian, post Samuelsonian, post Keynesian, post Friedmanian world is something that should remain as kind of the core that economic students are taught, and then building on that, you kind of like modify it on the margins, or it's more like you need to like really go back to the foundations and maybe start from like, you know, the Adam Smith kind of picture of broader vision, and then go to the sort of neoclassical core.
I think I used to be more sanguine against the neoclassical core when I was growing up, but now I tend to see the utility of it for educational purposes, especially price theory. How prices function, equilibrium. Although they might not exist, right? These are all abstractions. The bare bone of how things work, but it gives you a way of understanding how prices interconnect. So I think I'm more sympathetic to the neoclassical, structure as a device of teaching the principles of economics, because the alternative is that everything is up for grabs, and then you have like you have very radical views about how the economy functions, which are empirically untrue, and they can say, oh well, we can use other methods to teach, more Marxist methods to teach how the economy function. I'm trying to be very skeptical of those methods. So I think the neoclassical synthesis plays a very important function of keeping part of the world as it is, whereas if there's no that, everything is up for grabs. So I think I wouldn't touch it. I think it's important, but as you said, I think it should be complemented with political philosophy. It's very important, like or like David Hume, Adam Smith, right? Because economics is not a value-free, endeavor. It's related with ethical, moral questions, so I think the price theory and the neoclassical synthesis will tell you something about how prices move, but whether it is ethical or not to expand markets or expand markets in, for example, I don't know, like organs, for example, that's also an ethical question, not necessarily only an efficiency question. So neoclassical synthesis will help you to understand the efficiency and the consequences of intervening with the system, but that doesn't respond the problem on ethical grounds or moral grounds, which is why you need, political philosophy and understanding history and understanding, sociology, basically, of that society. So I think they complement each other.
So you've written a paper called Complexity Defying Macroeconomics in Cambridge Journal of Economics. I think that's an interesting, maybe a point of, very briefly, could you say, like, how do you see that, for example, complexity theory can be brought into, or partly in opposition to, but partly complementarity to existing issues in macroeconomics?
Yeah, well, that piece was born out of like my kind of like a philosophical justification for my non-formal approach in my dissertation. So because my dissertation was like about on macro and banking, and our supervisor, Mark Pennington, kind of requested me to have like a chapter, an introductory chapter, kind of like justifying my lack of method, or more like my analytical narrative approach rather than a formal method. So that piece was born trying to criticizing formal methods in macro, because I'm very skeptical about macroeconomics in terms of like the technical and the regression thing on the macro and the formality behind macro, and so I'm still more skeptical there. For instance, I'm less skeptical of applying empirical techniques to more contained issues, to more like a political shock or like political intervention or like a micro intervention, those kind of things you can study more neatly and more empirically clean. I'm less convinced that macroeconomics can become like that. So that piece was trying to criticizing the macro approach, applying like a complexity theory. And by the way, I'm not the only one who is skeptical. Like people say, these skeptics are usually like heterodox economists. Paul Romer, that won the Nobel Prize in 2019, has a devastating piece about the pseudoscience of macroeconomics. So I think there's a lot of like pseudoscience in macro, in regards to, you know, like DSGE models and all those kind of things. I'm less I'm more skeptical on those formalistic and empirical methods in the macroeconomy. So my idea in that piece was kind of like say like we should try to find other approaches to embrace to understand the complexity of the macroeconomy. Which ones we can debate. In those times, I was trying to advance the idea that maybe, you know, some agent-based modeling, so computational methods might be interesting. Analytical narratives, I think, for example, Romer and Romer, that they might win the Nobel Prize pretty soon. They do like you know, Friedman style analytical narrative macro. So they use data and stuff, but they also use analytical narrative and history to shed light on the issue. I'm more sympathetic to that approach than stochastic DSG models.
Okay, good. Now, so it seems that you really have you're trying to find a balance, and I think it's a very valuable balance between keeping the very important disciplinary role of having a core curriculum in a discipline, that is having a shared understanding of, you know, the ceteris paribus conditions of what we're doing. Like, so, you know, you can't even talk about ceteris paribus if everybody has their own model, right? Because if everybody has their own model, then you know, there's nothing that's ceteris paribus, nothing is kept stable. And so I think there's a convergence, there's a you can build on something that's a bit stable, even if you realize that it has limitations, right? And I think that's what's been done. But, you know, but I think at the same time there are real recognitions now from multiple parts of heterodox economics, behavioral economics, that sometimes you do need to explicitly build those more complex or more sort of like nuanced aspects of decision making or about institutions into the models to get good outcomes. And I think here your work is really in the same spirit as we already mentioned, Adam Smith for sure, and the Scottish Enlightenment vision of society that I think underlies the rich PP perspective. But you also are building on people like Hayek, who famously said that you know, to be a good economist, you have to be more than an economist. It's not enough to be an economist.
Yep.
And I think you also, some of the other Nobel Prize winners like Elinor Ostrom, who also very heavily, you know, is really trying to build these connections, right? So that's the idea of polycentricity, thinking about multiple levels and multiple types of context, of institutional settings, decision-making settings, governance on multiple levels. And also I should mention that Adam Smith, of course, famously was a professor of moral philosophy. And I think it's always been there at the heart of the discipline and should remain there. Indeed, in my case, I come more from moral and political philosophy into interest in economics. And it was only when I realized that you need to understand economics in order to understand social change and in order to understand how complex systems operate in society that I got into economic analysis. But you know, how I frame this issue, you see clearly yourself in this period of Adam Smith, Hayek, Ostrom's, and also maybe Vernon Smith and the humanomics vision.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner, has a wonderful collection of essays, and the title of the collection is Economics Between Predictive Science and Moral Philosophy. So I think economics is basically that, you know, where one leg is in moral science, moral philosophy, and the other one is a predictive science. We're trying to do both, maybe unsuccessfully, but economics lives in this tension between being a branch of moral philosophy, ethical question, moral questions, you know, value-laden questions, and on the other one, predictive, where, you know, if you put price controls, this is what would happen, right? We also have some predictions based on our models, right? So I think economics lives in this productive tension between being a predictive trying to be a predictive science, obviously with limitations, but also trying to be a moral science. And I think by that tension is one of the beautiful things about economics being an engine of social change, being an engine of social progress, right? Marshall, the famous, you know, the father of neoclassical synthesis, basically, right? Marshall believed that economics could be a tool for social progress above everything else, because it's a tool to understand the world and to predict how things will occur, what will happen if you do certain things. So it's a predictive science, but also has a moral component that we can, you know, move forward to try to make the world better. And I think that tension is what drives many economists, right, into the profession of, we can use data, we can use empirics, we can use, you know, predictions with moral, with a moral value to trying to advance, promote progress. And I think, which is why, it's kind of like economics is so overpowering, or like, like we call it about like, this kind of monopolization of the economics into other stuff. But but going back to your question about this kind of worldview, I think, yeah, probably the most biggest influences throughout my academic, when I was, becoming an academic, definitely the F.A. Hayek, and as you said, right, this idea about like nobody. I have that quote in my website, like nobody there's no economist that can be a good economist by only being an economist, right? So that was a big influence in my career. And also, yeah, Elinor Ostrom, Adam Smith, and James Buchanan will also be following to that kind of like more trying like different approaches to understand. James Buchanan used game theory, formal modeling. He was very skeptical in econometrics, but otherwise he used analytic narratives, political philosophy, game theory, formal modeling. So did Elinor. So why we should shy away from these methods if they can help us to advance the idea of social progress, right? And finally, weirdly enough, I find a beautiful essay by John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes wrote the obituary for Marshall when Marshall died, and it's a beautiful essay. I highly recommend it. And in that essay, Keynes says a good economist needs to be not only an economist, he needs to be a good historian, he needs to be a good, formal theories, he needs to understand mathematics, he needs to understand history, he needs to understand the particular, but also being able to generalize it to the general and offer the general to the particular. So it's a beautiful quote that you can guys find it, into which Keynes is saying, like, what are the good qualities of an economist? And oddly enough, I think it overlaps with Hayek's quote. People think, yeah, Keynes and Hayek were kind of like rivals, but in reality, if you look at the intellectual relationship that they had way more in common than what divided them.
Well, indeed, I noticed you had read a book about, was it by or about Keynes's writings, and so what do you think is the thing that classical liberals often miss about Keynes?
Yeah, I was just finished a collection of essays it's like a penguin, like a special penguin little collection of like the best of Keynes, right? Like little fragments. And it was quite interesting because, classical liberals, we tend to like be brought into the economics thinking, like Keynes is like kind of like the devil. Even like Millet, Millet says like, oh, Keynes is like the devil. So you're raised into this mythology, right? That Keynes is like the devil that we should attack. When in reality, if you read Keynes, there's way more that puts us in common, that separates us. For example, he was extremely critical of the Soviet Union. He went to the Soviet Union right during the revolution. He was very critical of radical change. He was a Burkean in many senses. Similar to Hayek, he was very critical of radical change. He was very critical of using violence to change political systems. He was very much in favor of little experiments and progress through try and error. Very Popperian, very Hayekian. He was very a bourgeois. He was a bourgeois economist. Obviously, he was more a technocrat than perhaps that many classical liberals would concede. But he was very pragmatic in the sense that in economics we always pick. There's nothing perfect. We always compare, imperfect things, and we pick the one that is least imperfect. Like, the Nirvana fallacy, Harold Dempsey, is a very approach of like classical liberal economists. We always pick, there's nothing perfect. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, right? Like the famous Thomas Sowell quote. Keynes thought in that way too. Keynes was all about, there's no perfect world. There's just imperfect solutions. And the least imperfect is capitalism. And hence we should try to make capitalism better and study it and not destroy it and try to tweak it in order to make it better. But it's not perfect, but the alternatives are much worse, right? So I think there's a lot of, Keynes' philosophy, his Burkeanism, he's critical of formal modeling. He was very critical of formal modeling. His view on probabilistic grounds, his defense of individuals he comes from a very the Bloomsbury group was very influential on Keynes, Virginia Woolf and all that crowd that embrace individuality, liberation. The individual is the one that should, be free and express itself and build itself. So Keynes was an individualist, a hardcore individualist. He had hated for authoritarian regimes. He thought, that the collective will oppress the individual. So if you put it in the balance, I think there's way more that unite us than separate us from Keynes. Only, the bastard interpretation of Keynes, after, Hayek's formalization of the ESLM model and all that, and then all his ideas got hijacked by bureaucrats, right, and politicians. Obviously, those things we should criticize, but his ideas and his way of the world is very akin or very overlapping to the one that classical liberals embrace, at least on my reading.
I like your reading of Keynes. The only thing I might slightly disagree with or push back on is the idea that that the blame lies in the hijacking and interpretation, because I think in Keynes there is a hole that wasn't plugged in terms of where it could lead, because he believed that all it takes is a few smart people to really set the world right. He was kind of elitist in that way, and I think that allowed for the technocratic mentality also to seep in, even though he believed in individualism and he considered himself kind of a liberal. But I think that's the lesson we can also learn from him, that it's not enough that you feel in your heart of hearts that you are committed to these things. We need to think about how do we keep the accountability right? How do we keep how do we make sure that the institutions are not permanently hijacked by whichever technocracy happens to be in place, which actually kind of leads to our paper as well.
No, I think you're right. I think one could say that he had too much faith in the benevolence of the bureaucratic despot. He thought that everybody would be like him and would try to do the best for the world without, advancing his own self-interest. So he was very naive in the public choice sense. So he didn't put too much emphasis on rules and constitutions and check and balances and how to tame the bureaucrat, because of the bureaucrat will probably abuse his power as they did, after in the 70s. So I think, yes, I think he had a very romantic view about the technocrat as the savior, as a person that will do good, because in his defense, he wanted to do good. He gave his life to public service. He gave his life to trying to advance a good cause, to trying to the world so the world can be a better place. But yeah, definitely he was very naive in regards to the lack of institutional details. She should have read more Buchanan. Unfortunately, Buchanan came much later, but yeah, definitely.
Well, speaking of romantic visions of technocracy and the contestations of technocracy, so we wrote a paper in Economy and Society on Chile and technocratic governance in Chile in the context of the neoliberalism and cyber socialism debate. So our paper deals with the so-called Project Cybersyn as the starting point, thinking about Allende's flirtation with cybernetics, and then we contrast that with the neoliberal, we call it experiments of neoliberal experiment under Pinochet. So tell us about why you wanted to be involved with this paper, and what do you think is what are we trying to do with this paper, man?
It was all your fault. Let's start with that caveat, because I was because this paper we started writing like maybe 2 years ago or something. I was very hesitant to write about Chile first. I didn't want to write about Chile. I don't know why. But now since that paper, I've written like 3 more about Chile. So I think I overcome that kind of like a mental block. So it all started by you. You were more interested in I knew about it. Of course, being born there and reading the economic history of Chile, I know a fair deal about the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I mean, I was born in 85. I was born under a dictatorship, so I experienced a little bit also, and I studied the case, so I was in good shape to help you in that project. So you invited me along, and it's a fascinating story because probably listeners don't know much about Allende's attempt to create like an internet or like a supercomputer. Right? So let's give some context. Allende, of course, he tried to create a sort of like a socialist revolution through democratic means, which is already, that's a big tension that maybe we can unwrap that later. But Allende came to power elected democratically, and he wanted to gradually make a transition to socialism or towards a Marxist economy through embracing democracy, through like the people and stuff. So there's a lot of tensions that we can talk about. But the important point for the scope of the paper, right, was that he, in order to increase efficiency, in order to increase, sort of like a central planning efficiency for the socialist economy, because he was kind of like a central pan Marxist in that sense. He wanted to centralize, the economy. So he thought it would be cool and important to have, real data and, sort of like a large language model to process data and, gather all the data of the factories, centralize them in Santiago, in La Moneda, in the House of Government, and then, plan and efficiently allocate resources in order to overcome the central planning problem based on this massive data gathering. So it was a very ambitious project. It was very cool. It was kind of unique before the internet, right? So it was like a supercomputer, kind of like sounds very like Star Trekky, and it was very Star Trekky in the designs. So they brought this person from the UK, right, Stafford Beer, which was all about complexity, and he was all about system theory. And I think this is also a point in which we kind of overlap, because you were interested in Bentalancy and also in Beer and complex systems and system theory. And I also were incidentally interested in this through Paul Lewis, rest in peace. Paul was professor of ours at King's. And Hayek was also interested in system theory, was also interested in Bentalancy. So I have read a little bit of Paul Lewis' work, which is fantastic work on how Hayek became imbued and influenced by systems theory. So I was like, oh, this is a very cool. Paradoxically, this is a cool kind of like relationship, right? What we think like Marxist central planners and Hayek they don't have nothing in common, but in reality, they have a lot of overlap in regards to system theory. Both of them, for good or ill, they thought they were following some ideas of system theory and complexity. One's applied to one camp and the other was applied to the other camp, right? I don't know how you feel that relationship.
I know exactly. I think that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do this. So Stafford Beer, I didn't know much about until I really started looking into this, but turns out he was one of the leading cyberneticians in the UK branch of cybernetics. I mean, cybernetics started out with people like Norbert Wiener in the 40s in the US mostly, but then there's a very strong UK component to this research, and there was a lot of overlap, international conferences. And Stafford Beer was a really fascinating. I mean, he's a personality. I mean, if you listen to his lectures, he tells stories, and he's full of really interesting ideas, metaphors. He thinks in this very complex way, but I think it's interesting. I think he manages to get into a lot of interesting issues about how the human body works, how the mind works, how the cultural sign processes work. So I partly come out of this from my interest in complexity theory, and as you like to point out, but I also had a background interest in semiotics, which is the study of science and communication. And indeed, the first version of this paper I presented in Finland at a semiotics conference before we started working on our version of the paper. And I think it's important to realize that we're really exploring here kind of the ways in which, on the one hand, we are both attracted to a vision of complexity and a vision of thinking about the society as an information transferring system. It's all about the Hayekian knowledge issues. It's all about how we get kind of social norms evolving, how we get all these complex phenomena being interlinked into this productive, evolving, dynamic, adaptive whole. But it's all the matter in the details of how we interpret this, how we apply this. And I think we found out so you mentioned the Allende regime, but then there's also the Pinochet side of the thing. And part of what I was really fascinated by is that there's multiple of these contradictions. So let's start with the fact that we have the idea of designing freedom. That's the title of our paper. It's also the title of one of Beer's works. So Beer had this idea of designing freedom, and that's what he wanted to apply in when he was hired by Allende to work on this project. That, to be fair, was never fully implemented, but it was partly built up, and then of course the coup happened, and then it was all torn down.
Yeah.
But there were small scale experiments with it, and Allende was very much invested, as were some other of the technocratic elite around Allende. But the idea of designing freedom, I think, was kind of one of the key paradoxes or contradictions. I'm really fascinated by this idea of, like, yeah, you want to maximize freedom, but to do that, you want to have planning. You want to have, building control mechanisms, right?
No.
And a part of this, like, well, this sounds like an intellectual mistake, but at the same time, you find that this kind of same idea does underlie a lot of, I think, the good ideas in cybernetics. That is, you can't really have freedom unless you have some kind of institutions, right? Unless you have rule of law, unless you have, some amount of governance, right? Governance itself is a control mechanism. I mean, it is a way of regulating, governing, controlling the system, right? And it's just a matter of what kind of control system do we have? Who designs it? Is it very centralized? Is it very decentralized? And what happened here, I think there was kind of an overshooting in the level of, we can have both by having a very strong central government, a very strong command center. They actually built like a command center, like a Star Trek command center to oversee the whole economy, while still having, like, supposedly real decentralization or subsidiarity to the level of the individual factories, workplaces.
Yeah.
The idea was that this internet system, this kind of really just a glorified fax machine network, could produce real-time information and feed it into the central computers, which would then do some statistical analysis, some prediction modeling, forecasting, and also be subject to various kinds of controls. But the idea was that it would not be like that one person makes all the decisions, but most decisions would be decentralized. But it actually turned out that in the end, given that the democratic, so-called democratic road to socialism model of Allende was really pushing for nationalization of the economy, was really pushing for heavy authoritarian measures, certainly towards the end of the reign. This really, I think, impacted the way that the decentralization was never really properly implemented. And then I also want to talk about the neoliberalism side of things, but anything to say about that?
No, yeah, I think that the interesting part of the paper is that both systems try to implement a different form of design freedom, right? As you said, they were trying to contain and design freedom from above and restrain certain freedoms, but give some other freedoms, right? But only in a circumscribed kind of like control environment, following the ideas of system theory, and the ideas of Beer. So in one case, as you said, right, in one case they're trying to give some freedom to workers, but they were pretty much like under surveillance 24/7, right? And funny, remember in the early versions of the paper, we had this footnote about Allende wanted to put a television that kind of records everybody's home. So his government thought of the idea of adding like a little screen on every home, so every time people can be like monitored and people can like give us input of how they feel about the government and stuff. So like very dystopian, very like like a kind of like Orwellian kind of thing. So yeah, so his project had a very like surveillance kind of like top down kind of like, I'm gonna tell you what to do you're free only in a circumscribed environment. You're free as a worker to be empowered and to do whatever you want, but only within the parameters that I'm gonna give you, right? So it felt very kind of like designing freedom, very restrictive, very kind of like top down, very one sided. The flow of information came, the command was very vertical, no horizontal. So it wasn't really empowering or democratic, right? And on the other side, right, in the neoliberal case, in the Pinochet case, Chile gained a lot of freedom, in some sense, right, in economic freedom, right. You see like a jump in economic liberties, but at the same time you see a lot of restrictions in civil liberties, political liberties, human rights, right, and so forth. So they kind of like it's a flip side, right? They kind of like design freedom again. You're free as Pablo to do whatever you want, only if you don't protest on the streets or gather more than 5 people, or you want to vote, or so forth, right? So you're free to maybe make a business, on import things and own things. You have a lot of economic liberties, but you're not free to say what you want, read what you want, think what you want, even be outside your home after midnight, because we had curfews for like years, or like armed political parties and so forth. So it felt another kind of design freedom, right? A sort of like very constrained, very top down. This is the liberties I'm willing to concede to you, and those are it, right? Nothing else. So both of them feel kind of wrong if you are like a true friend of liberty, right? If you care about individual freedoms, and in all senses, in the broader sense of the term, both seem kind of like very wrong. And there's some people that kind of like the transition, in Pinochet, the kind of like classical liberals that kind of like are sympathetic to Pinochet, and what he did. And in some sense, it feels like wrong-sided, because it's also a form of designing freedom, right? You gain some freedoms on one side, but you're losing many other freedoms, on the other side. So I feel like it's the wrong way of framing how things should be. And yeah, we talk about also the relationship also related to this point, right? Hayek had a very, kind of like very instrumental way of seeing things when he went to Chile. He went to Chile twice, I think, right? If I'm not mistaken. He was very condescending to the Pinochet regime. He met Pinochet, and he was very, kind of like one-sided. Whereas on the other hand, Milton Friedman was not. Milton Friedman was way more consistent in his defense of liberty. He was, he acknowledged that Chileans won liberties on one hand, but they lost many other liberties on the other hand. But he thought that through the economic liberties, Chileans will regain political liberties in the future. But he was very rational and consequential, and he was very, showing this dichotomy, whereas Hayek was way more putting these things under the rug, right? So we kind of use these two figures, right? Beer on the one side and Hayek on the other side, to showing that both sides can have pitfalls, right, in regards to how they see liberty. And it's funny because I still consider, for me, Hayek is the most important intellectual figure of my career, and is probably my favorite thinker of the 20th century. But that doesn't make it any less wrong when he went to Chile. He was a human being, and human beings are also susceptible to biases and susceptible to ideology and susceptible to mistakes. And I think this point Hayek was completely mistaken, whereas Friedman, on the other hand, was not. I don't know how you see it.
No, exactly. And I think the rather rather shameful way that Friedman has been treated in relation to this affair. I mean, you can have lots of criticism about some aspects of maybe what he's done or said. I mean, I'm not saying he was a saint, but definitely, I think the way that he was, booed during the Nobel ceremony, or the way that he's been singled out as this demon of of neoliberalism, is, I think, is wholly unfair. If you look at Friedman's real deep convictions about democracy, and he, as far as I know, never really took a theoretical stance that Hayek, from Hayek's point of view, very also solid classical liberal point of view, saying, well, unlimited democracy. I mean, he used the word unlimited democracy as being a threat. Now, when you identify unlimited democracy as a threat, that of course raises the possibility that you are attracted to some versions of authoritarianism, at least as a transitory measure, and that's what Hayek ended up sometimes doing. It's like, because he saw democracy as a way of, again, if democracy is a pathway to socialism, then that is just a way of undermining freedom, and that is a version of what he famously, of course, called the road to serfdom. It's the democratic road to serfdom, which he saw happening so many times during wartime, crisis time, or when you have a strong ideology like socialism. But I think what our paper really does is we highlight a couple of really surprising factors. I think one of them is that yes, Hayek comes out worse than Friedman here. Friedman comes out pretty well, in fact. That's number one. Number two is that there's actually a much more continuity or similarities between the so-called radically ideologically different regimes of Allende and Pinochet. Namely, they both employed a cadre of technocratic intellectuals to set up, decide what the commanding heights of the economy should be, and then strongly enforce those rules. That is, or those decisions. That is, you have a general, or you have a strong president who's really laying down the law, and sometimes it's the law, it's the decision, or it's really the personal decision of the one-man leader, which is, again, a vision of society that we are not completely unaware of or inexperienced with in today's world. But I think that's one of the things that we highlight, that you might come from very different point of view, but you are breathing the same air of what we call high modernism in this case, which is also the idea of there's this passion for kind of using government and using technocratic means to achieve good, right?
Yeah, very related also with Scott. What's the name of the author?
James C. Scott.
James C. Scott, right? I was very influenced by. I'm still very influenced by his book. I think it has very, very strong Hayekian and Ostromian undertones, and I highly, for those listeners who haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It's probably one of my favorite books that I've read in the last 5 years. Really, really, really fantastic stuff. And that his idea about this idea of modernism, right? This idea of the technocrat that uses technology and knowledge and is gonna tell us what to do to improve our world, right? And we just need to follow the science and follow him or her, and we'll reach progress, right? And never mind local knowledge, never mind local culture, never mind what the people in the ground are gonna say. Just shut up and follow the Washington Consensus, follow the rules that have been imposed, right? And usually those things backfire pretty badly. And in the case of Allende and in the case of Pinochet, both did backfire pretty badly. So I think one of the lessons that we can get from those is that whenever you disregard the local human beings that have also say, usually the outcomes are Pareto, like suboptimals, and also they backfire. They come back with a vengeance, right?
Yeah, so I think we have lessons for both the left and the right here in terms of, there's a lot of mythologizing about these regimes. There's a lot of, I think, misinformation about what they were doing, and I think we're really saying no, kind of both sides here got things wrong. I mean, both sides could be seen they have some good intentions, whatever. We're not even talking about intentions here. We're talking about what actually went down and when the theory, in a way, met the reality, right? And we're saying a lot of things could have gone better, and there's a lot of things we can learn. I mean, maybe history is a teaching lesson for us. Yeah. Let's think about, for example, today we still face a reality where we have kind of the left wanting to take control of the economy to impose their vision of society, and then we have the right wanting to take control of society to impose their vision of society. And now we also, of course, face the AI reality, which is kind of even more of a connection to the Project Cybersyn of Allende. And let's just have let's put computers in place and the experts and the computers. They're definitely going to make things right. Nothing could go wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But by reviewing history, and this particular case, the Chilean history, you can also have lessons and extrapolate that message for the present and for the future in the face of like technological surveillance that we're now is already here, right? So
Excellent. Anything else about our paper? I think we're getting close to the end, but I do have one more topic I want to discuss. But anything else you want to say about our paper?
I think I invite everybody to read it. It's open access, so everybody can read it. So
that's right, and I'll put the link, of course, in the description as well. But one author who's very, I think, important to you and many others is Pablo Neruda, and Pablo was experiencing the time of. I mean, I think he passed away not far after kind of Allende came to power. So let's first discuss that. I mean, so he's certainly someone who's tied to the political context, but
very much so.
But how do you think that he's kind of like how the sort of like the artistic community and are viewing this link between arts and politics as a result of the experiences like Pablo and others?
Yeah, I mean, he's a fascinating figure. I'm called Pablo because of him. Pablo Neruda. My name is Pablo because of him. We have a house nearby his house. He used to live in a little beach town called Isla Negra. And my family used to, since the 40s onwards, my Italian ancestors were used to hang out there. So Pablo was kind of like a neighbor. They saw him. My dad saw him with Allende a few times. So Pablo was a figure that was present both intellectually and also, he was there at the beach with near my family. So it's a very close figure to my personal life trajectory. And also, I really like his poetry in general. And also, he won the Nobel Prize, which is in Latin America. It's not something that happens often. Chile is only 15 million people. We have 2 Nobel Prize winners in poetry. So poetry is a big tradition in Chile. And he's one of the towering figures of poetry in the Spanish-speaking world. So much so that people say that Canto General, which is like his most ambitious work, is kind of like the La Divina Commedia it is to Italians, right? For Italians, right? Dante and La Divina Commedia is like the most important piece of work in that language. In the Spanish-speaking world, people say that is like akin to that Canto General of Neruda. So he's a very important figure, but also at the same time he was also very political. As you well said, he was a senator. He was very involved in the political party. He was part of the Communist Party. He wrote a poem to Stalin in the 50s, I think he did. So he was he was a communist in the he had the political card of communism, but he didn't know anything about communism. He didn't know anything about the economy. He didn't know anything about political systems. He was very naive and very romantic in that sense. He was very lyrical. He was a poet. He knew about how to make songs and write beautifully about heroic prose about these revolutions and this change. But he didn't know anything about, dialectical materialism or philosophy. He didn't care, honestly, about the politics of communism, about the politics. So he was selectively naive in that sense. So he loved my interpretation is that he loved the heroic gesture and the image and this idea of being together and we have a voice that we're gonna speak to the world together. And if you read Canto General, it comes across in that way, right? Canto General is about these individuals that in Latin America they're building from the mud, and they come together and they are singing because they've been oppressed for so many centuries, and now they have a voice, and the poet is that voice of those oppressed. So it's a beautiful image, of this collectivity rising together to meet up the times and become better together as a collective and being part of the course of history. So it's beautiful, it's fantastic. but it has no substance in theory, it doesn't have any contact with realities, but it's a beautiful poem. It's a beautiful image. And I think, going back to your question, I think culture and art is very important for social transformation. If you learn a little bit of the Chilean history back in the 60s and the 70s, musicians and poets play a huge role in making, the culture more collective, more pro-socialism, more pro, communism. If you have people like Neruda, writing poems to Stalin, then why not? Maybe communism is that way. Communism is that north, right? Maybe that voice will come through that political, agenda. So I think, for both for good or ill, I think art can really, really play a very important transformative role, both in culture and also in institutional change. Going back to Douglas North, right? Douglas North had this idea about, like, institutional change, about how ideas shape the institutions that we have. Art should be studied by Northian institutionalists, because Chile is the perfect example how art help shape institutional context and institutional transitions. All the Violeta Parra, famous folk singer, all the poets were socialists, were pro socialism. Neruda was a communist, so everybody was producing songs and music and themes and way of seeing the world that were very pro socialism, pro collectivity, against private entrepreneurship, and that shapes a whole generation. The generation of my father grew up listening and singing these songs. They didn't even know the profound message that comes beneath it, but they just sing it. But they don't understand that by singing it and loving it and replicating it, they're also transmitting an institutional baggage, or like a way of seeing the world that has implications to how the country will be run in the next election. So I think there's a beautiful connection there, completely underexplored in the social sciences, about how art can become a mechanism of social and of institutional change.
Um, I think that's a fascinating topic that I think we should maybe continue another time. But I do want to just end up with a couple more questions about art as stripping away the political and economic layer. What is it about Neruda that really speaks to you? Why is he so important to you?
He has a few things that I find very interesting. I really love his childlessness. He's a very controversial character because he wasn't the best of the human beings. But leaving his persona aside, I love his playfulness and just childness. She is like a little boy, even though he was like a massive 100-kilo poet. He was a little child. He was in love with little things, with little objects, with collecting things. He was always inspired by his infancy and the images of where he grew up, little things that spark his imagination. So he wrote poems to onions, to shoes, to toys. So he was always playing, and I think life should be like that. I think it's a powerful message. Obviously, obviously reality is a big constraint, but I think we should live life in a little bit of like a child. We should embrace the child within us and be playful and play, both with our ideas, with papers, now with the research. We should be playful, but also with our own lives. I like Neruda for that kind of like a cheekiness and that playfulness that he has. Also, he has a very emotional component, very romantic component, and also I think the heroic aspect of his work is very, very. When you read it, you get the chills, and when you read like this heroic, these individuals coming together, this like awakening of the nature of this human code, it feels very like a historical materialism, but done poetry. And you can always it's very easy to buy it because it's so beautiful reading, so like lyrical. I haven't come across to something that have maybe in the last few years that I've been reading. Melville, Moby Dick, comes very close giving me that feeling of like, wow, this is like an heroic adventure, and these individuals are like, doing something transcendental that is gonna change the world in a different, obviously in a different terms. But I felt that lyricism and that heroic gestures and that poetry coming through Melville is akin to what I felt with reading Neruda, and also obviously the fact that he was our neighbor is also very it plays a big role too, I guess.
That is an amazing fact that you live close to him. And comparing Melville and Neruda in terms of the type of heroism that is at play, certainly in Moby Dick there is an existential kind of journey that really is more about the person who's doing the journey than the destination. And there's also a tragic dimension to it, right? Do you think that there's a difference in that how the hero's journey in a way ends or culminates? Is it at the same level of kind of existential self-reckoning that you find, or is it different type of pathos?
Yeah, and Melville, as you well said, is way more individualistic. It's way more about these individuals involved in this quest. Obviously, it's a little bit of collectivity of the fact, they're in the boat, and they're gonna face the end together, right? But it's more about the Captain Ahab gesture and quest and madness, right? That drives everybody into. So it is very, in a way, individualistic driven. So it's driven by an existential question of one individual, whereas Neruda is like the whole Latin America is in an existential quest, right? The individual is us. There's a unity. We as Latin Americans, we are in this existential quest to find ourselves, and we are in this boat, right, to be part of history and to make this transcendental move, right? So I guess, yes, you're right. There's like a very similar themes, one running through an individual and the other one running through like a whole like continent, which is why sometimes, Neruda, they compare Neruda to Walt Whitman, the famous American poet, Leaves of Grass, this idea of finding the voice of Americans, right? The one voice that unite us and, help us to become one into this existential quest. But maybe you can make the case that there's a little bit of that too in Melville. The fact that everybody's in the boat together, and they're 15. Same with the region, the federations of the U.S. There's also some messages in Melville that is a collective quest that they're embarking to.
And in Whitman, you find this idea of the multitude within, of the voice of the multitude in a way within, that I am large, and there is that. It's in a way a collective within a single self as well. What is the one thing that people outside of the Latin American context or Spanish-speaking world don't understand about Latin American poetry or literature?
I think maybe is the way that Latin Americans confront the. I think there's also like the institutional trajectory. They're always like the fact that it was colonized, the fact that it had this like kind of like institutions that permeated throughout. So there's always been this ethos in Latin America about being colonized or being put down or being like part of like a hierarchy and being under an oppressor. And I think that kind of like vision is very strong in Latin America, and you can also read it in Neruda. This emancipation, like Latin Americans are emancipating from the oppressor, and I think that's also still a lot less so after the globalization world, or less so after Fukuyama's end of history, let's say. But I think it was very strong throughout, like the 20th century. This idea that Latin Americans are in a way under extractive institutions and under this kind of like a despotic regimes or extractive regimes that are taking our things away, either by imperialists or by whoever, or capitalists, whoever. So the main character changes, but the dynamic is always the same. There's somebody that comes and is gonna like subjugate you. So there's always this idea of like, we should rebel, we should be free from them. I think that's a very strong theme that goes throughout at least from the 30s until the 80s in also the dictatorship episode kind of like reinforces, right? So now there's a dictator that does the same. Before where like, the capitalist, and then after neoliberalism is another capitalist. So there's always the main character always changes, but this idea of like being subjugated by extractive institutions kind of like permeates a lot of like the subconscious of Latin Americans, and which is very negative because it gives you like a very zero-sum view of how things are. Whereas, we believe in Pareto improvements and in, positive sum games, and free markets and the economy is a positive sum game. But it is very hard for Latin Americans just to break from that mindset, I think.
And I think it exemplifies the fact that many post-colonial societies don't reach that level of security about their own future. That is, that they always struggle against that legacy. And
Yeah.
some manage to get over it, but it's a deep memory and deep legacy. So
Yeah.
the last question that I want to ask you is about a completely different author from different culture, namely Haruki Murakami, because I know that you also love him, and you also when you were visiting Japan, I think you also did a kind of a pilgrimage to some of the places where he was. So why is Murakami so important to you?
Yeah, I love Murakami. When I was in Japan this last summer, and I went to his library. He studied at the Waseda University. So the Waseda University created a library in his name, in his honor. It's a beautiful.
That's in
It's in
Kyoto?
in Tokyo.
Oh, Tokyo.
Yeah, in Tokyo. So
Okay.
if you're ever around, you should go. It's it's free for everybody. Everybody can enter, and it's designed in like a Murakami fashion. And he has all his vinyls and his books and stuff. So it's a cool library to visit. Murakami's been a part of my life for the last, I guess, almost 10 years now. I've read all his books and all this stuff. And there's something, it's hard to explain why I'm so hooked by him. Because I think it kind of like speaks to me. I like literature that kind of gets through you, speaks to you, like kind of touches you, or put a glimpse of your own personality. You find yourself reading through that, right? And it doesn't happen to it doesn't happen often, or it doesn't happen with every book. Excellent books, but you might not connect, right? It's like people. Sometimes you can meet like wonderful people, but not necessarily you connect. With novels and with writers and with books, it's sometimes like that, right? So sometimes just you cannot explain it, why you fell in love with that person. It just happens, right? With Murakami, for me, is more like I feel in a way that his books speak to me. I really like his characters, the way he portrays loneliness, the way that he portrays like modern loneliness, how individuals, we feel in this kind of like a alienation and loneliness that all his characters drag, that I think we always struggle with as modern human beings, despite the fact that we're social and we have friends and we're talking here. Also, we're also dealing with our own kind of like moments of alienation and loneliness and distance, and kind of like feel that you cannot communicate with others. It's like paradoxically, right? Because we're so many friends, so many WhatsApp, so many Facebook friends, and so many connections, but yet you still feel pretty lonely sometimes. And I think Murakami underscores that very well. Like he portrays that essence of modern life very well. Also, I love his passion for music. I love jazz. I love classical music, and that component of his books really speaks to me. The jazz, the rhythm that is in his novels, the way he plays with music, the way he plays with classical music and jazz, the references. Always, I really, really, really like those kind of like plays with that, and also perhaps one of the other things that I really like about him is this play with dreams, these dreams and these worlds that people cross, this human being crossing weird worlds. So some people call Murakami like magical realism for that reason. I think it's slightly different than Latin American magical realism, but there is this like dreamy, eerie component of these individuals entering into these eerie worlds, and they get Murakami characters gets transformed without wanting to be transformed. And I like that because life transform you whether you want or not. You have to I think it's how to say it, is very like a Buddhist in some sense. Like Buddhists embrace these changes, and they don't try to fight them. They just try to go with the flow of the changes rather than trying to fight them. Most of Murakami characters, reality happens to them. They're not heroes seeking an adventure, or they're not heroes seeking to change themselves or be better. They get dragged usually by these currents, by this dream, by this weird world, and they have to embrace it, and they have to adapt to them, and through that they become maybe better, maybe not better, maybe different. And I think life is just like that, right? Life takes you to places, to worlds, to meet people, to relationships, to things that you may not be ready for it, but you have to move along. And I think there's a lot of beautiful things about modern life, or life in general, that his themes touches. And finally, he loves cats, and I'm a huge cat person, and I'm obsessed with cats. So every time there's a cat, I think of him. So I don't know. This is also like a cat lover thing related to Murakami.
Do you think being a cat lover makes you a better economist?
Maybe. I don't know. I guess it's less strenuous than having a dog. So in that sense, you're more productive than people with other pets. I have my co-authors. I call my cats co-authors, or research assistants. So I think they're very beautiful emotional supports. And always I like the fact that in Murakami's book they always come and go. They disappear, but they come back, or they're always there but not there.
Yeah, I feel like cats are partly of this world and partly of some other world. So they are visitors to our world, and we must respect them for that. Okay, well, perfect. I think we circled all the way around from philosophy and economics to art, and I think that's the one lesson that I think I want to highlight, is that once you realize that to be an economist, or to be a good anything in your specialization, you need to think outside of your specialization. It doesn't just mean look outside the other sciences, look to the philosophical foundations, but also look to art, look to culture, look to the lived life that is around you. And it is that connection between life and art and science and philosophy that I think animates the best science and best philosophy.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We couldn't end up with a better phrase than that one. So yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you so much for being here. Do you have things you want to plug? I'll definitely put a link to all the papers and books we discussed. Anything you're working on these days?
Yeah, I'm working with a lot of different things, but always trying to keep those three strands of my research, like political theory, political science, and applied political economy. So trying to embrace the PPE approach in the best way I can. Also, a little bit of work on Chile. I'll send you some links so people can check them out if they're interested. But yeah, thank you so much, Otto, for inviting me. It was a wonderful talk. And I like the fact that we tend to from social sciences toward and toward Murakami, and because I think I agree with you that art and literature are very important parts of the human endeavor, because as social scientists, but also humans, and we should be enriched by those experiences as well.
Great. And next time we'll have a debate about cats versus dogs, but we'll save that for next time. Okay, Pablo, thank you so much, and catch you another time. Take care.
Thank you, Otto. Yeah, looking forward for the second episode.